Bumpy Johnson survived 15 years in Alcatraz, but on November 14, 1961, his own chef tried to end him with ground glass hidden in a perfect steak. 8 years of pain, 6 years of planning, 8 hours locked in a freezer at 10 below zero. What did Bumpy do after that made his enemy regret everything forever? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. November 14th, 1961. Exactly 9:47 in the evening, Bumpy Johnson's hand froze mid-air. The fork hung 5 centimeters from his lips, suspended in a moment that would change everything. Around him, the Red Rooster hummed with life. 47 people, 12 exits. 3 potential threats his brain had already cataloged before the steak arrived. The 12-ounce ribeye sat before him, seared medium rare, resting in a pool of garlic butter and fresh thyme. Perfect. Too perfect. Clarence had outdone himself. The aroma alone was enough to make a grown man forget his troubles. His nose caught it first. Beneath the rich aroma of beef and herbs, something metallic whispered. Not the iron of blood-rare meat, something sharper, foreign, wrong. His eyes narrowed, studying the surface. The way light reflected off the butter was wrong, slower, fractured by particles that had no business being there. The sheen was different. Disrupted. Bumpy cut into the steak. The sound was wrong. A faint grinding, a frequency that didn't match flesh, separating from flesh. Glass vibrates differently than meat. 15 years in federal prisons had taught him that. The sizzle wasn't right either. The meat sang at the wrong pitch, glass fragments, resonating against steel like a broken tuning fork. He raised the first bite. The texture against his fork felt off. The elasticity was wrong, like chewing silk and finding sand. The meat registered 58 degrees Celsius on the outside, but the interior temperature spiked in irregular patterns. Hot spots where there shouldn't be hot spots. Foreign objects conduct heat differently. Physics doesn't lie. A flash. Alcatraz, 1954. A man named Torres in the cell next to his. Someone had paid a guard $20 to sprinkle ground glass into Torres's mashed potatoes. 6 hours later, Torres was dead. Internal organs shredded into ribbons, bleeding from the inside, wondering why his stomach was on fire. Bumpy had heard the screams through the wall, had watched them carry the body out the next morning. Bumpy's brain processed it in less than a second. This isn't food. This is a weapon. 4.5 meters away, Clarence stood watching, hands trembling slightly at his sides. Watching. Waiting. Bumpy bit down. The moment stretched like taffy. Glass punctured the underside of his tongue, a pinprick of precise pain. Sharp. Immediate. And he knew with absolute certainty someone in this room wanted him dead. The cut into the meat produced a sound only he could hear. A grinding, a scraping metal on mineral. The fork trembled imperceptibly in his hand. Anyone else would have missed it. I have 90 seconds to decide, swallow death or reveal I know. The choice was made before conscious thought could interfere. Bumpy chewed slow motion in his mind, though his jaw moved at normal speed. The glass fragment pierced his tongue. Sharp, surgical, a bead of blood mixed with saliva. He tasted copper. Pain is information. Swallow equals death. Spit equals war. Starts now. He reached for his wine glass with the calm of a man enjoying an excellent meal. Took a slow sip. Swished it gently, washing the glass fragments forward in his mouth, away from his throat. Surgical precision disguised as appreciation. The wine turned pink with his blood barely visible in the dark liquid. The alcohol stung the cut on his tongue. His face remained placid, composed, a mask of satisfaction. But behind his eyes, his brain calculated at lightning speed. 12 suspects in the kitchen. Any one of them could have touched that plate between preparation and service. The dishwasher handling the china. The prep cook arranging garnish. the sous chef doing final inspection, Clarence himself. The wine completed its work. Glass suspended in liquid, no longer a threat to his esophagus. Safe. Controlled. Neutralized. Bumpy raised his napkin, dabbed his lips like a gentleman appreciating a fine meal, and deposited the evidence into the white cloth. The glass. The blood. The proof. 23 people were watching him at various points during the meal. None saw what had just happened. The deception was complete. He cut a second piece of steak. The performance continued. Raised it toward his mouth, touched it to his lips, felt the texture one more time, confirming what he already knew. Chewed air while his left hand, hidden by the table's edge, slid the meat into the napkin on his lap. His jaw moved with perfect rhythm, consistent, convincing, a masterpiece of deception. He took another sip of wine, nodded slightly, the universal gesture of a man satisfied with his dinner. Let his eyes drift closed for a moment, as if savoring the flavors. Sold the performance completely. Across the private dining room, Clarence's eyes tracked every movement like a hawk watching prey. In the chef's mind, he's eating it. The glass is in his stomach now. 5 more minutes and he'll collapse. The pain will start. The ambulance won't arrive in time. By the time they figure out what happened, it'll be too late. Justice. Finally. Bumpy caught Clarence's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. For a split second, their eyes met in the glass. And in that fragment of time, Bumpy saw it. The hatred. Raw, ancient, 8 years old, still bleeding like an open wound that never healed. The man who wants me dead is standing in this room. And he thinks he's already won. The drive from the Red Rooster to 127th Street took 11 minutes through streets Bumpy knew like the lines on his palm. Curtis drove in silence, stealing glances at his boss in the rearview mirror. Something was wrong. He could feel it. The Cadillac pulled up to the brownstone at 10:32 in the evening. Curtis opened the rear door and felt it immediately. Something was different. Mr. Johnson moved the same calm exterior, same measured steps. But underneath an alertness Curtis had only seen once before, the night before the war, with Dutch Schultz erupted in 1938. That particular quality of stillness that preceded violence. Like watching a coiled spring, Bumpy stepped onto the sidewalk. His eyes swept the street in a practiced arc. 17 windows. 8 shadows moving behind curtains. 2 unfamiliar cars parked where they shouldn't be. License plates he didn't recognize. Make and model wrong for the neighborhood, on the surface calm. A man arriving home after dinner. Beneath, ready for war. Every muscle coiled. Every sense amplified. Every shadow a potential threat. "Get Juno," Bumpy said quietly. His voice barely carried across the space between them. And Nat Pettigrew, within the hour. No public phones, go to their homes directly. Tell them code red. Curtis's hand tightened on the car door. Code red. He'd never heard those words before. "Everything all right, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy paused at the door, turned. The streetlight caught his eyes and Curtis felt his spine stiffen. He'd seen men die with less warning than that look. Ice and fire combined. "Someone tried to kill me tonight at the Red Rooster, in front of the whole damn dining room." Bumpy's voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that preceded earthquakes. "By sunrise, I want to know who, why, and where they're hiding. Clear." Curtis nodded, his throat suddenly dry. He was in his car and driving before Bumpy's front door closed. War doesn't start with gunfire. It starts with a piece of meat. Inside, Mamie was reading in the parlor, a novel resting in her lap. She looked up, saw her husband's face, and set her book aside without a word. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read him like scripture. The slight tension in his shoulders. The way his jaw set. She knew. Bumpy crossed the room in 4 strides, placed the stained napkin on the coffee table between them. unfolded it carefully as if handling evidence in a courtroom. The half-chewed pieces of steak sat in the center, glistening with saliva and blood. Fragments of glass caught the lamplight like cursed diamonds. Some pieces were barely visible, ground fine as sand. Others large enough to see clearly, sharp enough to kill. "Ground glass," he said, his voice flat, empty of emotion. "In my rib eye." Mamie's hand went to her throat, an involuntary reflex of fear. "Lord have mercy." The words came out as a whisper. "Who?" "That's what I need to find out." Bumpy sat down heavily, the first sign of fatigue he'd allowed himself. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the weight of what had almost happened. What should have happened. His detective's mind was already working, sorting through possibilities like a card dealer arranging a deck. Patterns, connections, motives. Could have been anyone in that kitchen, 12 staff members, any one of them could have touched that plate. "But you suspect someone." Bumpy was silent for a moment. His eyes drifted to the napkin, to the evidence of his near death. The steak was already beginning to discolor, the garlic butter congealing into a pale yellow solid. "Clarence prepared it himself, brought it out personally, watched me eat." He exhaled slowly, the breath of a man who'd just run a marathon. 6 years, Mamie. Every Thursday. Perfect every single time. Impeccable. Not a single mistake. And then tonight. You think it was Clarence?" The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Bumpy's gaze remained fixed on the napkin, fixed on the proof. "Clarence prepared the meal with his own hands, carried it to my table, stood there watching me eat." He paused. His eyes were wrong, not nervous, not guilty, expectant, waiting. "Either he wants me dead," Bumpy said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "or someone's controlling him. Someone used him, got to someone else in that kitchen, made him a weapon." Mamie leaned forward. "Why, that's the question. Who is easy to find? Bodies leave trails. Why is the key to everything?" Bumpy shook his head slowly. "The who tells you the hand. The why tells you the brain behind it. In Harlem, no one kills for money. They kill for pain." By midnight, the parlor had transformed into a war room. Maps of Harlem spread across surfaces, notebooks, photographs, lists of names, the accumulated intelligence of an empire built on information and fear. Juno Brown arrived first, 53 years old, built like a boxer who never stopped training. Shoulders that filled doorways, hands that had broken bones and held dying men, knuckles scarred from 1,000 fights, eyes that had seen 3 lifetimes worth of violence and remembered every face, every name, every debt. A knife scar at his throat, souvenir from the Dutch Schultz days, a reminder that he'd been seconds from death once before. He'd killed for Bumpy, bled for Bumpy, nearly died for Bumpy twice. Once in 1940, once in 1956. Both times he'd walked away. Barely. Nat Pettigrew came 20 minutes later, thin, quiet, forgettable, which made him the perfect weapon. The kind of man you'd pass on the street and never remember. Average height, average build face that blended into crowds. He ran the streets between 131st and 145th. 15 blocks of Harlem territory. Nothing happened in those blocks without his knowledge. A shooting, a deal, a conversation, a stranger. Bumpy's eyes and ears, a living network that made Harlem readable. A human surveillance system more effective than any technology. Bumpy laid it out like a military briefing. The stake, the glass, the survival. Every detail, precise. Clinical. No emotion, just facts. "I need to know everyone who was in that kitchen tonight. Every cook, every dishwasher, every busboy who walked through those doors. I need to know who's been talking to outsiders, who's got money problems, who's got grudges." Juno cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp as breaking wood in the quiet room. "You want me to bring them in?" Not yet. Bumpy's voice carried the weight of hard-won strategy, years of surviving wars by thinking 3 moves ahead. First we watch. First we listen. A hunter in a hurry catches the wrong prey. Patience finds truth. He turned to Nat. The Red Rooster. Who really owns it? Earl Washington on paper. But you know there's Italian money behind him. Silent partners downtown. Costello's people arranged the liquor license back in '54. The name Costello hung in the air like smoke, heavy. Dangerous, loaded with history. Bumpy let it settle, eyes narrowing to slits, the gears turning, calculations being made. Frank Costello's been circling Harlem for years, looking for entry points into the numbers game. Any movement from his people recently? Anything unusual? Nat hesitated. The pause itself was information. In their world, hesitation meant significance, meant something worth hiding. There's a name I keep hearing. Vincent Tagliero. They call him Vinny Eyes. He's been spotted uptown more than usual. 125th Street, 135th. Places he's got no business being. Doing what? Nat's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. Talking. Buying drinks. Making friends. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Building something. Bumpy nodded slowly. The picture was forming in his mind, still blurry at the edges, but taking shape like a photograph in developing fluid. Connections forming, patterns emerging, the outline of a conspiracy. Start with the kitchen staff. I want names, addresses, families, debts. Everything. By morning. Harlem's about to wake up, but someone's never going to sleep easy again. November 15th, 6:12 in the morning. The sun hadn't risen yet, the city still wrapped in that particular darkness before dawn. The hour when secrets come out. Nat returned to the brownstone with a folder full of handwritten notes, intelligence gathered from a dozen sources, bartenders, street vendors, the man who ran the newsstand on 132nd, the woman who cleaned the Red Rooster after closing, the night porter at the hotel 3 blocks away. Everyone talked to Nat eventually. He had that kind of face, trustworthy, forgettable. 12 names. 12 lives. 12 potential killers. He spread the pages across Bumpy's desk, like tarot cards revealing fate. Each sheet a window into someone's private world. 9 were clean. No debts, no connections to organized crime, no reasons to want Bumpy dead. Small people living small lives, grateful for steady work in a Harlem kitchen that paid on time and didn't ask questions. They went home to families, paid their rent, attended church on Sundays, kept their heads down. But 3 names had red asterisks. 3 problems. Marcus Bell, dishwasher. Owed $400 to a loan shark on 142nd Street. Could have been pressured. Threatened. His sick wife fighting pneumonia at Harlem Hospital. 3 small children under 10. Bills piling up. Motive weak. A man that desperate would take money, not risk his life for revenge. Too scared. Too broken. Doime Franklin, prep cook. Brother doing time at Rikers for armed robbery. 18 months left on a 3-year sentence. Could have been leveraged. Someone could have promised to help the brother get him transferred to a better facility, reduce his sentence, make the time easier. But not enough deep hatred. No personal connection to Bumpy. No history. Motive medium. Clarence Mosley, head chef. 6 years of impeccable service. Not a single complaint. Not a single missed day. Perfect attendance. Perfect performance. No debts, no vices, no gambling, no women, no drinking, no obvious pressure points. Clean as fresh snow. A model employee, but a dead brother. Just those 3 words in Nat's careful handwriting. Brother died 1953. Motive unknown. Tell me about this, Bumpy said, pointing to the note next to Clarence's name. 3 words that would change everything. Nat shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The movement of a man who knew something terrible and wished he didn't. His younger brother, Delroy Mosley, died back in '53, beaten in an alley behind a grocery store on Lenox. By who? Nat didn't answer immediately. His silence said everything. In the space between question and answer, truth lived. Ugly truth. By who, Nat? Nat's voice dropped so low, Bumpy had to lean forward across the desk. Juno's boys. They were looking for a runner named Samuel Pitts who'd stolen $800 from one of our counting houses. Delroy matched the description. Light-skinned, slim gray coat. Wrong place, wrong time. Nat exhaled the breath of a man confessing sins. They realized the mistake too late. They beat him in the alley until he talked. Except he didn't talk because he didn't know anything, because he wasn't Pitts. By the time they figured out the mistake, the kid was barely breathing. They panicked. Left him in the rain. He died 3 days later at Harlem Hospital. The room went silent as a tomb. Silent as death. Bumpy stared at the wall jaw locked tight. His hands gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. I never knew about this. His voice was low. Dangerous. The kind of quiet that preceded thunder. It was handled, Nat said quietly. Or it was supposed to be. Juno's men paid for the funeral. $200, made sure the family was taken care of financially, kept it out of the papers. No police investigation. But Clarence knew. If he did his own digging, yeah, he would have found out. Nat paused. A brother doesn't just disappear without questions. Someone asks, someone investigates, someone finds the truth eventually. Nat closed the folder, his voice heavy with the weight of years. 8 years, Bumpy. That's a long time to carry hate. Bumpy stood. The chair scraped against hardwood loud in the silence. Walked to the window, looked out at Harlem, waking up beneath a gray November sky. Street lights flickering off one by one, first workers heading to early shifts, buses starting their routes, the city breathing. Living. Unaware. 8 years. Every Thursday, every perfect meal, every smile, every, "How is the steak tonight, Mr. Johnson?" Every, "I hope you enjoy it, sir." Clarence hadn't been cooking for him. He'd been sharpening himself like a blade on a whetstone, waiting for the moment when patience and opportunity finally aligned, when rage and chance finally met, when the perfect moment arrived. And Bumpy had never seen it coming because he hadn't bothered to know. Delroy Mosley was just another body in the machinery of an empire. Collateral damage in a war. Bumpy was always winning. A name that never made it to his desk. A mistake buried under 100 other mistakes. A footnote. Nothing. Until now. Clarence wasn't cooking for me, Bumpy said quietly, more to himself than to Nat. He was sharpening his knife. Every Thursday, every perfect meal. Waiting, preparing, planning. He turned from the window. His face was unreadable as stone. "Find Vinny Eyes. Don't touch him. Just find him. I want to know exactly how he wound Clarence up and pointed him at me like a loaded gun. Costello never gets his hands dirty, but today he will." The trail to Vinny Eyes led through a social club on 116th Street, a barber shop that served as a message drop, and finally to a back booth at an Italian restaurant in East Harlem, where the man himself sat eating linguine like he didn't have a care in the world. Nat's people watched from 4 different angles. 6 men rotating through 3 shifts, none of them knowing the others, each one a ghost in the city's machinery. They photographed from rooftops with cameras borrowed from a newspaper man who owed Bumpy a favor. They recorded conversations from parked cars with windows cracked just enough for sound reel-to-reel tape spinning in the trunk. They tracked every face that approached Vinny's table, every hand that shook his every envelope that changed ownership in the shadows between streetlights. At the social club on 116, they watched for 14 hours straight. Men came and went, like tides playing cards, drinking espresso thick as motor oil, talking in voices too low to carry past the front door. Vinny held court at a corner table, his back to the walleyes on every entrance. They called him Vinny Eyes for a reason. Nothing escaped his notice, or so he thought. He never saw the photographer on the roof across the street, never noticed the man in the tobacco shop who wrote down every license plate, never suspected that the beggar on the corner worked for Bumpy Johnson. The barber shop was more revealing. 9 people passed through in a single afternoon, 8 of them walking out empty-handed, their haircuts crisp and sharp. The 9th man, a thin Italian in a gray suit, left an envelope tucked behind the mirror. The barber retrieved it 30 minutes later, slipped it into his pocket, and made a phone call from the back room. Nat's people couldn't hear the conversation, but they saw where the barber went afterward. Straight to Vinny Eyes. The restaurant in East Harlem was where everything crystallized. Vinny ate there 3 times a week, always the same booth, always the same meal. Linguine with clam sauce, a glass of red wine, a cigarette after. He looked comfortable, relaxed, like a man who'd won a war without firing a shot. But Nat's people weren't watching Vinny. They were watching the ghosts around him, the people he'd touched in the weeks before the poisoned steak. The surveillance photos told a story that made Bumpy's jaw tighten. 5 weeks earlier, on a Sunday morning, bright with autumn sun, Vinny had approached Clarence outside Mount Olivet Baptist Church. The congregation was streaming out, their voices raised in conversation and laughter, their Sunday clothes pressed and perfect. Clarence had been walking alone, his head down, his hands in his pockets. Vinny had stepped into his path, blocking him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. Clarence's body language shifted from confusion to anger in the span of 3 minutes. He walked away with his shoulders tight, his hands balled into fists, his face twisted in something that looked like pain. But Vinny came back. He always came back. That was how men like Vinny worked. They didn't take no for an answer. They just waited, probing for weakness, looking for the crack in the armor where they could slip the knife. 3 times over the following weeks, Vinny returned to that church, waiting for Clarence after service like a demon at the gates. Each conversation lasted longer than the last. 8 minutes, 15 minutes, 23 minutes. Clarence went from rejection to hesitation, to listening, his body language shifting like a door that had been locked for years, slowly swinging open. By the 3rd meeting, Clarence wasn't walking away angry anymore. He was walking away thoughtful, his face pale, his eyes distant. 2 weeks before the steak, the final meeting took place at a diner in the Bronx. Neutral ground, far from Harlem, far from eyes that might recognize either man. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. Nat's man watched from across the street, camera in his lap, counting the minutes like a doctor counting heartbeats. When Clarence walked out, his face was pale as hospital sheets, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped his keys. The deal had been sealed. Whatever Vinny had offered, whatever poison he'd whispered into Clarence's ear, it had worked. Now in Bumpy's dining room, the surveillance photos were spread across the table like evidence at a trial. Bumpy studied them in silence, his mind assembling the timeline with the precision of a prosecutor building a death penalty case. Nat stood on one side, Juno on the other, both men waiting for the verdict. Vinny didn't pay Clarence, Bumpy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't need to. Money wouldn't have worked. You can't buy a man who has nothing left to lose. He tapped one of the photos, Vinny's hand on Clarence's shoulder outside the church. He just gave Clarence something money can't buy, the opportunity to kill the man responsible for his brother's death. Nat shifted uncomfortably. Revenge. The most dangerous currency in the world. Bumpy finished. He set the photo down, his fingers lingering on the edges. Costello's smart. He doesn't attack with bullets. Bullets make noise, attract attention, start wars that cost money. He attacks with memory. He finds the wound that never healed and tears it wide open. Then he steps back and watches the blood flow. Juno cracked his knuckles, the sound like small bones breaking. "What do you want me to do with Vinny?" "Nothing," Bumpy said. "Not yet. Let him think he's safe. Let him eat his linguine and smoke his cigarettes and believe he's untouchable. When the time comes, he'll get his message. But first we handle Clarence." The night settled over Harlem like a blanket, heavy and warm, despite November's chill. At precisely 8:15 in the evening on November 15, 1961, Juno's men found Clarence Mosley in a rooming house on 143rd Street, 3 blocks from where his brother had died 8 years earlier. The room was small, barely large enough for a bed and a dresser, the kind of place men stayed when they were running from something or towards something and needed to disappear in between. Clarence was packing a single suitcase, his hands trembling so badly he could barely fold his clothes. A white shirt fell from his fingers twice before he managed to get it into the case. He kept looking at the door as if he knew what was coming, as if he'd been waiting for this moment since the glass had failed to do its work. When the door exploded inward, wood splintering from the frame, the lock tearing free in a shower of splinters, Clarence didn't run, didn't fight, didn't even stand up. He just looked up at the 3 men filling his doorway, their faces hard as granite, their eyes empty of mercy, and something in his expression shifted from fear to resignation. "Took you long enough," he said. His voice was calm, almost relieved, the voice of a man who'd been holding his breath for days and could finally exhale. They didn't speak as they zip-tied his hands behind his back, didn't answer when he asked where they were taking him, didn't react when he said he understood, that he knew what was coming, that he deserved it. 3 men who'd done this work before, who knew that conversation only complicated things, that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't tried to kill Bumpy Johnson. They brought him to the Red Rooster through the back entrance, the alley door that opened onto a narrow passage between buildings where the garbage was kept and the delivery trucks parked. It was after closing nearly 10 at night when the dining room was empty and the lights were dim. But the kitchen staff had been summoned back by orders they didn't dare question. 12 phone calls, 12 terse commands, 12 people who dropped what they were doing and came running because when Bumpy Johnson called, you came. They stood along the walls now like witnesses at an execution, their faces pale, their hands clasped in front of them or hanging loose at their sides. Tommy Perkins, the sous chef who'd worked alongside Clarence for 4 years, who'd learned half of what he knew from watching Clarence's hands move across a cutting board. Doime Franklin, who prepped vegetables every morning at 5, whose brother was doing time at Rikers, and who understood more than most how quickly life could turn. Marcus Bell, who scrubbed dishes until his hands cracked and bled, who owed $400 to a loan shark, and knew what it meant to be desperate. The prep cooks, the busboys, the dishwashers, everyone who had worked beside Clarence for months or years, never knowing about the fire that burned inside him, never suspecting that every perfect meal had been practice for murder, that every Thursday night had been a rehearsal for the moment when patience and opportunity finally aligned. In Harlem, justice was theater, and everyone had to watch. Bumpy entered last exactly 10 minutes after Clarence had been brought in. Those 10 minutes had been deliberate, calculated, designed to let the fear ferment. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing on the tile floor like a judge approaching the bench. Each footfall was measured, deliberate, the sound filling the kitchen and bouncing off the stainless steel surfaces. He stopped 3 feet from Clarence, close enough to see the sweat on the chef's forehead, far enough to maintain the distance between king and subject. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence, stretched like wire, pulled tight, ready to snap. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of refrigerators and the shallow breathing of 12 terrified witnesses. "You should be dead," Clarence finally said. His voice was flat empty. "I put enough glass in that steak to shred your stomach into ribbons. Ground fine enough to slip past your tongue, sharp enough to tear through tissue like razors. You should have started bleeding internally within the hour. should have been dead by midnight. "I know," Bumpy said, and his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Alcatraz taught me things no man should have to learn. How to taste what doesn't belong, how to detect the weight of ground glass in butter, the way it changes the texture, makes it gritty when it should be smooth. How to swallow without swallowing, how to move food around your mouth like you're chewing when you're really examining." He paused, his eyes never leaving Clarence's face. "You've been cooking for me for 6 years, Clarence. 6 years of perfect meals, perfect service, perfect loyalty. But this meal, this one you made for yourself." Clarence laughed, a bitter sound that held no joy. "You don't even remember him, do you, Delroy? My brother. 19 years old, beaten to death in an alley by your men because he was wearing the wrong coat. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong goddamn coat. They thought he was someone else, and by the time they figured out their mistake, he was already dying." "I remember now," Bumpy said quietly. "Now." Clarence spat the word like poison. 8 years later, 8 years after I had to identify his body at Harlem Hospital, after I had to tell my mother her youngest son was dead, after I had to bury him in a pine box because we couldn't afford anything else. 8 years after your man Juno sent $200 in an envelope like that was supposed to make it right. Tears welled in his eyes, but his voice stayed hard. "You took everything from me. Everything." Bumpy stood motionless. The kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerators. "I didn't order what happened to your brother. I didn't know about it until yesterday." Bumpy said, his voice stripped of authority. "I was in Atlanta that month, federal court. By the time I got back, it was over, handled, buried." He paused. "But he died because of my operation. My people, my war. Your brother got caught in that machinery, and it ground him up, and I never even knew his name until yesterday." He took a breath, his chest rising and falling once heavily. "That's not an excuse, that's a confession." Clarence blinked, his eyes widening slightly. Whatever he had expected, it wasn't this. "Your brother was innocent. He shouldn't have died. And you shouldn't have had to carry that weight alone for 8 years. Bumpy took a step closer, and his voice turned to steel. "But you tried to kill me, Clarence. In my city, at my table, in front of everyone who matters. You tried to make me bleed out from the inside while I smiled and thanked you for the meal. And you would have done the same if someone murdered your family," Clarence shot back. "Maybe," Bumpy nodded slowly. "Maybe I would have. If someone killed someone I loved, maybe I would have spent years planning, waiting, preparing." He paused, his eyes boring into Clarence's soul. "But I would have done it with my own hands, looking the man in his eyes, letting him know why he was dying. Not hiding poison in his food like a coward." Clarence flinched. The word landed harder than any fist could have. Power needs lessons, and lessons need witnesses. Bumpy turned to Juno. "Open the freezer." The walk-in freezer was against the far wall, a massive steel door with a handle that required both hands to pull. It was heavy, 6 inches of insulated steel designed to keep meat fresh at 10 degrees below zero. Juno crossed the kitchen in 4 long strides, grabbed the handle with both hands, and pulled. The seal broke with a sound like a gasp, and a cloud of frozen air rolled out like a ghost, like death itself, breathing into the room. Clarence's face went pale, his skin turning the color of old newspaper. Bumpy, wait. You spent 6 years in this kitchen," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "You made it your home, learned every corner, every surface, every knife and pan and burner. You turned it into your domain." He gestured toward the freezer. "You also turned it into a weapon. You used the trust we gave you, and you weaponized it." He took a step toward Clarence. "Now it becomes your lesson." Juno's men moved forward, grabbing Clarence's arms. He struggled, his body finally fighting, even though his mind had surrendered. But he was a chef, not a fighter, and his resistance meant nothing. They dragged him toward the freezer door, his feet sliding on the tile. The kitchen staff watched in frozen silence, their eyes wide, their breathing shallow. "Bumpy, please!" Clarence was screaming now, all composure gone. "I'll leave, I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." "I know." Bumpy's voice cut through the panic like a blade. "I know you'll leave. I know you'll never come back. But everyone else needs to see this. They need to understand what happens when you come for the king and miss." Clarence was shoved inside. The cold hit him immediately, a wall of frozen air that stole the breath from his lungs. He turned his eyes wide with animal panic as Juno began to swing the door closed. 8 hours, Bumpy said, his voice barely audible. "You'll survive. Barely. But you'll never forget." The door sealed with a heavy thud that echoed through the kitchen. Clarence's muffled screams echoed through the steel, distorted and inhuman. For almost an hour, those screams continued, growing weaker, more desperate, more broken. Then finally the screams faded. Silence filled the kitchen like water filling a drowning man's lungs. In darkness and cold, a man faces himself. Inside the freezer, time stopped meaning anything. The first 10 minutes were pure panic. Clarence screamed until his throat was raw, until he could taste blood. He pounded on the door with his bound hands until his knuckles split, kicked at the steel until his legs gave out. The cold was everywhere, seeping through his clothes, finding its way to his skin, his muscles, his bones. Minutes 10 through 30 brought a different kind of hell. The screaming stopped because screaming took energy his body was desperately trying to conserve. He shook so violently his teeth chattered like dice in a cup. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to trap what little warmth remained, but the cold was relentless. After 30 minutes, his mind started to drift. Delroy, at 10 years old, running through the rain on 142nd Street, his laugh bright and pure. Delroy, at 15, standing in this very kitchen, when Clarence had first gotten the job, his eyes wide with amazement. "You did it, big brother," he'd said. "You really made it." Delroy, at 19, the last day wearing that gray coat. "I'll see you tonight. Ma's making your favorite." But he never came home. Hours 2 through 4 brought a different horror. The feeling left his fingers, not gradually, but suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. His toes went next, then his feet, then his legs. The cold was eating him from the extremities inward. Hours 4 through 6 brought hallucinations. Delroy appeared in the corner of the freezer, not bleeding, not broken, just standing there watching. "What are you doing, Clarence?" "Getting justice for you. This isn't what I wanted. I never wanted this. You're dead. You don't get to want anything anymore. And you're dying. For what? For revenge that won't bring me back." Hours 6 through 8 brought clarity. Delroy had died because of a mistake. Clarence was dying because of hate. Both were waste. The only difference was that Delroy never had a choice. Clarence had chosen this. Outside, Bumpy stood near the freezer door. He didn't leave. He listened to the screams grow weaker, listened to the silence that followed, and thought about empire. He'd built his kingdom on bones, but he'd forgotten to count them. How many Delroys were there, and how many other Clarences were out there sharpening their knives, waiting for their Thursday night power without memory? Is tyranny. Memory without power is torture. Bumpy had both, and neither brought peace. At 6:15 in the morning on November 16th, Juno opened the freezer door. Clarence was curled in the corner, barely conscious. His lips were blue. His fingers were black with frostbite. 3 on his left hand, 2 on his right. Juno's men pulled him out, wrapped him in blankets, called a doctor, who asked no questions. Clarence would live, but he would never cook again. Bumpy stood over him as the doctor worked. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no triumph, only weariness. "You're leaving New York," Bumpy said quietly. "Tonight. Don't come back ever. If I see your face north of Philadelphia, you die. Not in a freezer. In the ground. Clarence couldn't speak, teeth chattering too violently. Bumpy reached into his coat, produced an envelope, set it on Clarence's chest. There's enough in there for a fresh start. Somewhere warm. You'll need it. Clarence's eyes widened. Confusion cut through the cold. I'm not doing this for you, Bumpy continued. I'm doing it for Delroy. Because I can't bring him back. Can't undo what my people did. He paused. But I can make sure his brother doesn't die in an alley, too. He turned toward the door, stopped at the threshold. One more thing. Your brother's grave. The pine box. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. By the end of the month, there'll be a proper headstone. Marble his name, his dates, and 2 words. Remembered always. He left without waiting for a response. In Harlem, every debt gets paid. But some bills never stop coming. 3 days later, Vinny Eyes received a package at his social club in East Harlem. Inside was a steak knife, frozen solid ice crystals clinging to the blade. Beneath it, a note in Bumpy's handwriting. The kitchen is closed. Stay out of Harlem. Vinny's hands trembled as he read it. The message was clear. Frank Costello's people never tried to recruit from Bumpy's territory again. War doesn't end with bullets. It ends with fear. Clarence Mosley left New York on a Greyhound bus 3 days later, his hands wrapped in bandages that would need changing twice a day for the next month. The doctor had given him pills for the pain, but they didn't touch the phantom sensations. The ghost fingers that still felt like they were there, even though 3 of them were gone, amputated at Harlem Hospital, while he lay unconscious from infection. His career was destroyed. His revenge had failed. And the envelope in his jacket pocket held enough money to start over somewhere far from the city that had taken everything from him. He settled in Miami, where the warmth helped with the constant ache in his hands, where winter never came to remind him of that freezer of 8 hours in hell. He found work as a dishwasher at a seafood restaurant on Collins Avenue, the only kitchen job he could still perform. The owner didn't ask questions when Clarence showed him the blackened stumps where his fingers used to be, just nodded and pointed to the sink. Minimum wage, no benefits, cash under the table. It was the kind of work Clarence would have laughed at 8 years ago, when his hands could do magic with a knife when chefs from across the city came to watch him work. He never cooked again. Couldn't. The missing fingers made it impossible to hold a knife properly, to feel the texture of meat, to do any of the 1,000 small things that separated a chef from someone who just heated food. Some nights when the restaurant closed and he was alone with the steam and the silence, he would look at his hands under the fluorescent lights and remember. The freezer. The cold that had felt like it would never end. The man who had punished him and then paid for his brother's headstone in the same breath, who had shown him mercy and cruelty in equal measure, who had let him live but taken everything that made living worth it. Clarence never understood Bumpy Johnson. Never made peace with what had happened to Delroy, to himself, to the life he'd thrown away on revenge that tasted like ashes. But he never went back to New York either. The fear was too deep, the lesson too clear. Some debts couldn't be paid. Some wounds couldn't be healed. And some men, once they had you in their sights, never really let you go. The story, meanwhile, traveled faster than Clarence's bus ever could. Back in Harlem, the story spread like frost across a window, covering everything it touched with a crystalline clarity that made people see their world differently. The chef who tried to kill Bumpy Johnson, the glass in the steak, the night in the freezer. By the end of the week, every kitchen in the borough knew the details. The dishwashers whispered it over sinks full of dirty plates. The prep cooks discussed it while chopping onions. The head chefs told their sous chefs, who told their line cooks, who told the busboys, until everyone who worked with food in Harlem knew what happened when you tried to poison the king. The details grew and the telling became legend, became myth. Some said Clarence had lost all his fingers, not just 5. Some said he'd been in the freezer for 12 hours, not 8. Some said Bumpy had eaten the entire steak glass and all just to prove he couldn't be killed. But the core of the story stayed the same, solid as granite, true as gospel. You could hate Bumpy Johnson. You could dream about killing him, fantasize about it late at night when anger kept you awake, and revenge seemed like the only thing that would bring peace. But if you tried and failed, you'd spend the rest of your life wearing the proof of your failure. Your body would become a billboard advertising what happened to people who came for the king and missed. The message was clear. The lesson was taught. And Harlem, which had been holding its breath to see how Bumpy would respond to an assassination attempt, in his own restaurant exhaled slowly and went back to business. The king was still the king. The throne was still secure. And anyone who thought otherwise could look at Clarence's empty chair in the Red Rooster kitchen and reconsider. On a cold December morning, when the sky was the color of old steel and the wind cut through coats like they were made of paper, something changed in Woodlawn Cemetery. A marble headstone was installed over a grave that had held only a wooden cross for 8 years. The stone was simple, but elegant, the kind that would last centuries, that would still be readable when everyone who remembered Delroy Mosley was dead and buried themselves. The engraving was clean professional, the letters cut deep enough that weather would never erase them. Delroy Mosley, 1934 to 1953. Remembered always, Bumpy visited once alone on a Tuesday afternoon when the cemetery was empty, except for an old woman 3 rows over talking to her dead husband. He drove himself, no driver, no Juno, no witnesses. Just a man in a grave and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. He stood for 11 minutes without speaking. The winter sun was weak, offering light but no warmth, and his breath came out in small clouds that dissipated almost as soon as they formed. He didn't pray, didn't apologize, didn't offer excuses or explanations to a dead boy who couldn't hear them anyway. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, looking at a name carved in stone, and thought about the machinery of empire, about how many bodies got ground up in the gears, about how many names he'd never learned. After 11 minutes, he took a single white rose from inside his coat, bent down, and placed it on the fresh-turned earth at the base of the headstone. Then he stood, buttoned his coat against the wind, and walked away without looking back. Some debts could never be fully paid, but you could make the installment. That night, Bumpy sat alone in his study, a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk beside him, and looked out the window at Harlem spread below, like a kingdom of lights and shadows. Mamie had gone to bed hours ago, and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the distant sound of car horns from the street. Revenge doesn't balance the scales, he said quietly to the empty room, to himself, to the ghost of Delroy Mosley and all the other names he'd never learned. It just adds weight to both sides, makes everything heavier, makes it harder to move forward because you're carrying more than you carried before. He took a sip of bourbon, felt it burn down his throat, warm his chest. But sometimes, just sometimes, you can take a little weight off. Not much. Not enough to make the scales even, but enough to breathe a little easier, enough to sleep at night without seeing their faces. He set the glass down, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. How many other Delroys were there? How many innocent people had died because of his operation, his people, his wars? He'd built an empire on bones, and the foundation was deeper than he'd ever wanted to admit. Every policy racket, every protection scheme, every territorial dispute had casualties. Some deserved it. Most didn't. And how many Clarences were out there right now, working in his kitchens, driving his cars, standing guard at his doors, all of them carrying wounds they'd never shown, all of them sharpening knives in secret, all of them waiting for their Thursday night. The thought should have made him paranoid, should have made him want to purge everyone who'd ever lost someone to his organization. But it didn't. It just made him tired. Tired of the weight. Tired of the violence. Tired of being the man people feared and hated and tried to kill. but not tired enough to stop, never tired enough to walk away. In Harlem, every meal has a price, he said to the darkness. Every favor, every protection, every moment of peace. And tonight, I finally paid for mine. Paid for Delroy. Paid for Clarence. Paid for all the ones whose names I'll never know. He opened his eyes, looked out at his city, at the empire he'd built and the bones it stood on. But the bill keeps coming. Tomorrow, next week, next year. Someone else will lose a brother. Someone else will spend 8 years planning revenge. Someone else will put poison in my food, or a bullet in my back, or a knife between my ribs, and I'll have to handle it, have to teach the lesson, have to add more weight to scales that are already too heavy to lift. He stood, walked to the window, pressed his palm against the cold glass. That's the price of being king, not the attempts on your life. Those are easy. It's the weight, the names, the knowledge that your throne is built on graves, and someday someone's going to knock you off it, and you'll become just another name on someone else's list. Just another Delroy. Just another reason for revenge. The clock struck midnight. A new day. The same old city. The same old weight. Bumpy turned from the window, finished his bourbon in one long swallow, and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new threats, new debts to pay. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Delroy Mosley would sleep under a proper headstone. And that, Bumpy thought as he climbed the stairs, was something. Not redemption. Not forgiveness. Not even close to enough. But something.